right, we are, after the alert, after I hit OK. Who knows? I mean, it says the event is starting, John, so
I
like,
think it's live.
we'll see.
I'm hearing an echo of all the things that we said 30 seconds ago.
That's my fault, sorry. We are live and have been for 19 seconds, apparently.
Oh,
So.
okay.
And I see it. We are definitely live, John.
Oh,
So,
great.
John, now you're live to the world. So say hello,
Okay.
John.
Hello.
And
Hello,
I'll just
world.
put us all on now. Look at that! We have our title!
Yay.
Oh my goodness. So everyone watching, you will, as usual, be happy to know that we are here with no tech support today because everyone is at MS Ignite. And so please do tell us what the levels are like because I know that you love doing that.
We love hearing it today.
We love hearing it today.
do.
I've spent the last 20 minutes. Yeah, I've spent the last 20 minutes plugging things in and fiddling with light switches and trying to get stuff working. And I think I see people saying we're live. So I think we're live, John.
That's good.
Okay, we have guests today. So
We have guests. Should I should quickly do community links so that then we can pass off.
let's
to the guests?
introduce our guests first,
Yeah.
and then
I
we'll
guess
talk
so.
about.
I don't know
it.
who this guy is.
So who are you? Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
I am responsible for binding redirects.
Oh, well, we just lost 100 people from the stream. This is great. Thank you very much.
So I'm James Newton King of Jason.net and now also of the ASP.NET team.
Fantastic.
It's my first time on the show.
And you're where right now?
Redmond,
You're in Redmond, and you're usually in.
New Zealand.
James-
Visiting America.
James is visiting us.
Yeah. I'm Ryan Nowak. I'm a developer on the ASP.NET team. I work on MVC, Blazor, Razor, routing, HTTP Client Factory, health checks, and a few other things.
Good stuff. And you recently joined Twitter, I believe. Is that
I
right?
did recently. I'm a very spicy
A
boy.
very spicy boy.
With an eye. Boy with an eye on Twitter.
I'm pretty sure. I think the tweet that was just sent out by the ASP.NET
So if you-
account
if
includes
you-
your Twitter handle.
If you
Were
have.
you never on before?
I was not. I decided that joining Twitter in 2018 it's become like a hipster thing, and so it's
Yeah.
now appropriate for me to join Twitter.
There you go.
After
So, like,
everyone
my
else
teenage
is.
daughter just got a cassette player, like a
Yeah.
Walkman, and she's like, "This is super hip and retro." So like, this is what you're doing.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I'll get one next year.
All right, John. So you've got
Exciting.
some community links for us. Does John love
right.
community?
We need a song for this,
John
really.
loves community.
Let's
Fade
do
into
that.
John. Oh, it's just your head. Oh, there we go.
How about the community theme song?
Oh, that might get us into some trouble.
That would
Yeah.
get a copyright strike or something.
Yeah.
All right, let's do this. So starting here, .NET Conf. Two exciting things to know about .NET Conf. One is the stuff is all up on Channel 9. We have links to it right here. Tons of good stuff. We also have, going on around the world, we have live events. So we're at 156. People are still adding them on. They go through the end of October. So there's tons of local events you can get in on all around the world.
So what
Very
does that
exciting.
mean? There's a local event like now. If they're still adding them, like what's happening? I don't understand.
Yeah, good question. So what's happening is people are like during .NET Conf, people had viewing parties for it, and they were like watching stuff live. What's happening now is people are actually grabbing. We've made the content available. So out on the .NET presentations, events in a box content, we have the decks are available, and
I
so
see.
people are going through and doing like local presentations of them.
Oh, it's actual like flesh and blood people.
Yeah,
At physical
I
events.
mean, and we did this last year too.
Oh,
and
wow,
it was
okay.
So cool. We got people were emailing me links and stuff from like huge meetups and like Legos and Legos Nigeria and all across South America and through Europe. I mean, just everywhere. So, so they're going on around the world. They're like legit, like just tons of them, right? So, and they're still being added because people are saying, hey, there isn't one near me. Let's do this. So, so it's really cool.
Okay.
A lot of existing meetups are adding, are doing special sessions for them.
Cool.
And it goes from a like 1 or 2 hour thing, like, just a slightly bigger meetup, through some people are putting on full like 1 and 2 day conferences around it. So
Cool.
yeah, very cool stuff. And so that's the other kind of link off of this, is that the decks are available, which is kind of neat. We work, as I promised last time I was on, we were clubbing people over the head as they left their presentations and grabbing their decks from them. So
Cool.
exciting.
Just a quick mic check. We do have our first bit of feedback. Apparently I sound perfect.
Yeah.
Ryan, you sound perfect. John, you sound like you're a little far away apparently. Maybe put your mic closer. This is what this random called Sebastian, who works for us, is suggesting. James sounds like he doesn't have a mic at all, and that we're hearing from another one. I mean, I can hear you, so if you just check again.
Hello?
Yeah, no, I can't hear you through there actually. So you keep talking, John. I'm going to check James's level, all right? And maybe just try and click
Cool.
up a bit higher.
All right.
Okay.
So also at .NET Conf, we announced a new .NET Foundation website, and some links that Scott and I called out were built with .NET. So this is a really cool site where you can submit a project and let people know about it. So this is all kinds of stuff, websites, open source projects, just great stuff to know about. And they have featured projects and stuff. So this is very cool. This is new. And then another one that's been out for a little bit, but I just want to call it out again, is discover.net. So this is really neat. There's daily news, there's projects that need help. They've also got things in there like recent issues and upcoming events. So really cool stuff. All right, so we've got a few cool series going on. One is from Jeremy, and he's got this Getting Started with Angular on .NET Core 2.1. So this is an in-depth look, talking about the different templates and stuff. So he's this is number one. Then there's also links to 2 and 3 as well. So really good to see. I talked to Shane Boyer about this when we were both in NDC Sydney, and he was telling me that they're getting tons of, huge billions and billions of hits on these posts already. So knock his server over. So that is neat. Another cool thing that I just saw pop up were these from ASPNET Hacker. Honestly, I forget your name, ASPNET Hacker.
Oh, no.
It's Jürgen. So Jürgen has a series on customizing ASP.NET Core. This is interesting to me. I just did this talk at NDC Sydney where I was saying, like, what would you do for the first hour after file new project? And of course, he posted this like the day after. But I thought this was really neat. So this is digging into logging in this one, customizing logging, and then another on configuration. And so I'm excited to see this. He's got 10 parts planned out for this. So that is cool. Okay, ASP.NET boilerplate. So this is something we've been looking at for a while. It's been evolving over time. This is a neat kind of a it's kind of like omakase for soccer or for sushi or something. It's like a .NET template, ASP.NET with a bunch of stuff already kind of pre-set up for you. What's interesting here is they're actually doing a full rewrite for this. So it's going from ASP.NET boilerplate. They're renaming it to ABP, and they're also this is a full rewrite based on .NET Core and ASP.NET Core.
Nice.
Yeah, so this is really neat. This is and support for some newer things. Microservices, theming, modularization, all kinds of stuff. So the idea here is a kind of an opinionated look at file new project, and it's going to kind of, and they're kind of checkable. So you can say, I like this and this one, but I don't want to include this. So
James, do you have any comment to make?
It looks amazing.
I can hear James.
Yeah.
Did everyone else hear James?
Yay!
I just turned everything up. So it turns out the labels are wrong. And mic 2 is plugged into mic 1, and mic 3 is plugged into mic 2, and so anyway, I had to trace all the cables under the desk. I think we're good now, John.
I think Jeff Fritz, like as he left there right after,
And he just like rage pulled all the cables out and walked out.
He's like, ha 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 ha.
He probably meticulously scraped the label off one. And put it on the other.
All right.
All right. So here's another thing. I just saw this come in today. This is Blazor 060 Preview 1. So this is a preview. I haven't seen a blog post on this yet, but there's some cool stuff in here.
I think Sanderson tweeted it today. No blog post yet, yeah.
Yep.
Dan's working on the blog post, but he's at Ignite.
He's at Ignite. Yeah.
So one exciting thing that I saw in here was support for template-based components. Ooh. And in looking through, there's a huge thread in here about how exactly they should be implemented it and how HTML versus WPF versus XAML, which kind of feel to go for in there. I saw then digging into this a bit that Ryan, you'd made some like actual commits on it.
Yeah, I'm the dev on this actually. So I'm a little bit familiar with it.
So I thought this was neat. You've got so you're talking about here about a feature, Razor templates, which was already existing for a while, just little known.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple things here for templated components. So we added support for Razor templates to the Blazor dialect of Razor, which previously, if you'd done this, it just wouldn't compile. So you've added support. You can think of a Razor template, if you've never used it before, as like a Lambda that writes HTML. So we added support for Razor templates, so you can create sort of an inline template and you can pass it to a component, and that doesn't do a whole lot on its own. But we also added support for templates to have multiple child content items, and if you haven't done Blazor, think about like a grid component, right? You'd have a template for the headers, you'd have a template for the rows, maybe a template for the footer or some other things. And we've also added type inference for generic components. So you can write a grid of T, you can pass it a list of person, and then when you're typing inside that template, you should get completion IntelliSense for person. So if you're curious about any of these things, there will be a blog post soon about this, and then there's a series of commits and PRs on the repo that kind of explain the steps we took to get here.
Nice.
So this is probably the spiciest one here, the type inference for generic components, and the hope here is that things will just work the way that you want for some definition of.
So is this going to be separate from WebRazor, or?
It is separate for now, but with the caveat or with the hopeful explanation that Blazor is kind of our experimental hive. It's this bustling hive of activity where we're innovating and developing new things. So
we move fast and break things.
Yeah.
While we're working towards what the concrete 3.0 plans, as we've announced, I think Scott said it again today at Ignite. The plan is to take the most of the Blazor programming model in terms of the component model, the types of features that Ryan was just talking about, and move those or have those work in .NET Core 3.0 so that you can have Razor components and you can have this live interactive programming model but runs on the server. And we'll integrate it with Razor pages, we'll integrate it with MVC so that the existing Razor and new Razor components work side by side in a natural way, while at the same time continuing to experiment with what does it mean to run these styles of apps that are built purely on Razor components in the browser on top of WebAssembly. And so Blazor is kind of all that today, but it doesn't do any of the server-side integration other than the pure server-side Blazor model. And over the coming couple of months, we're going to figure out how to take those bits and graph them into the existing sort of Razor pages, MVC, View, Razor, etc.
There's some ideas we've had doing Blazor that we think are good enough and complete enough that they complete missing parts of the MVC and Razor pages story.
Yep.
Wow. Very cool. So we talked before about whether we should look at this now, and I think this makes sense to do kind of a follow-up show and dig into this more with demos and stuff.
Yeah, I think once 060 is out, you should definitely get the Blazor folks back in.
Cool. All right. So this was neat. This was at NDC Sydney, and there was, announced on stage, Barry Doran's announced Identity Server as part of ASPNET Core. And then he tweeted kind of some stuff about how it's done. So I have screenshots of code. So I don't really have anything more direct to link to on this, but it is exciting.
Yeah, you kind of jumped the gun there. We're not really ready to talk about that yet.
All right.
Which is why there's no more detail
Barry
available.
Said it, so, yes. Moving on.
Look for more information in the coming show.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, and then this was kind of interesting here. This is how to disable automatic model state validation in ASP.NET Core 2.1. So in this this post is talking about, in a lot of cases you would want to API controller is going to automatically do state validation. In the case that you wanted to do something like return a different error message or something, if you wanted to customize that, then this is talking about you don't have to. It's not all or nothing. You can go through and just suppress the model state validation. So pretty quick one here, but this is interesting to know about.
Cool.
And last one I've got here from Hisham, who is watching at 2 a.m.
Wow.
So very cool. Yeah. So hello to Yemen. So Hisham posted about adding tag direction. So for a tag helper component, for languages that are left to right to left, you need to be able to specify that. So for an RTL language, so spelling out here like Arabic, Hebrew, Persian. So this is interesting here about how to go through and actually specify that direction. So this is the implementation, and then the actual kind of just adding that in.
So what does it actually end up doing?
Yeah, so adding an attribute, and I believe if I have this right, that's already supported in HTML.
Yeah,
so
it is.
Body tag helper.
Yeah.
I see. So but it's using the server-side localization, culture awareness, and language awareness, I should say, to automatically write the client-side attribute for language direction based on the server-side language context.
Much better said than I did.
Okay.
Yeah, and so he's actually got a pull request in on that. That I don't know. Actually, though, that's on Simple Commerce, so I'm not sure what that's on. That sounds like a pretty useful thing, though.
Yeah, it's interesting. Localization is a complicated subject, so any help there is always appreciated. So that's good. Cool.
That's it for me.
All right. Well, I think we have some we had some guests for a reason today.
Yeah.
You fine folk are going to come and talk to us about endpoint routing, which I think we may have touched on briefly. Is a new thing in 2.2. It's very scoped in 2.2. It's really a complete re-implementation of the routing system, but will be only used by MVC in 2.2. You will not be able to plug your own stuff in as endpoint routes in 2.2. You will be able to get access to a service that lets you generate URLs based on things that have been registered with endpoint routing. And then beyond 2.2, in 3.0, our goal is to open up endpoint routing and to the entire pipeline, to the middleware pipeline, so that basically anything today that is middleware that can result in something being terminal, so like a handler in the old world, like something that actually handles the request and then sends a response. Any middleware that does that is a candidate to turn into endpoint routing. Routerware, basically, or endpointware. It's funny you say that. At lunch I was talking to Andrew today and we were like, there's probably a new name here. There's middleware and then there's like endware or there's something and that uses endpoint routing. And so as an example, Signaler would be updated. Static files, we're having a discussion right now. Health checks would be updated. The security middleware endpoints, because they all have terminating URLs that they hit. Anything that you would want to either be able to generate a URL for, or you'd want to go through a matching phase early to say, yes, this URL pattern maps to this piece of this handler that's going to run eventually, then it runs through the rest of the middleware pipeline, and then that handler would run, and then the output would obviously come back through the middleware pipeline. If you are something that has to match and thus execute at the end, then you will be a candidate to convert from, say, middleware today into an endpoint. Is that a fair way of explaining?
That's a fair intro.
It's just a concrete thing that jumped out at me because I'd heard that described and it wasn't really super real to me before. I ran into a bug and Glenn Condren my programming bug, and Glenn Condren pointed it out to me. I was setting up cores because I did a Blazor front end for the conference thing, and it wasn't working because I had set it up using middleware and I hadn't done it from the MVC side.
Yeah.
Right.
And Glenn was pointing to me. That's a perfect example of what this simplifies.
These are some of the issues that we're trying to resolve.
Yep.
Where
Exactly.
there's a middleware way to do it and there's an MVC way to do it,
Yep.
and you have to know about one of these, and then you change your code and you have to know about the other, or you're doing cores for your MVC actions and now you want to do cores to something else and you have to learn a thing. It's frustrating.
Or there's complete missing gaps. Like today, you can do authorization in MVC and in Signaler, but if you want to authorize static files, too bad. You have to do crazy map stuff, and we don't actually have an authorization middleware. We don't ship that code. Authorization today is done by the endpoints, the things that want to authorize you, and some other stuff doesn't do it. So in the future, there's the idea that there would actually be an authorization middleware, and you could put it anywhere in the pipeline, and then endpoints could then, anything that's registered as an endpoint could now be authorized. So, you can only see these static files if you have this claim or whatever it might be.
So we shouldn't jump the gun too much.
No,
There will be diagrams.
There will be diagrams to show this. So
painstakingly made diagrams.
with that, I will hand over. Who's going to go first? Who wants to?
James is first.
James is first. So let me flip over to James's screen. And James, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So, endpoint routing, it's actually had a couple of names in the past. You might have heard dispatching.
Yep.
Very briefly, it was global routing. Project Houdini is also something that's sort of fallen under. But endpoint routing is sort of its final name. And although we're talking about a new implementation of routing, a lot of what you use today still holds true, especially for 2.2. So you'll still see use MVC, and you're still calling map route. You're still setting up conventional attribute routing on your controllers and actions. But all the magic, at least in 2.2, the new routing engine, is happening under the covers. So the way it's enabled in 2.2 is via a compatibility switch. So by default, if you upgrade to 2.2, your application isn't using it. It isn't until you either set your compatibility version to latest, or you come into the options for MVC. There's this new enable endpoint routing, and setting that to true will also enable it. Or you can do it the other way around. If you update and you notice that endpoint routing is perhaps causing a regression in your application when you've set the compatibility to latest, you could choose to disable just endpoint routing. Do you want to talk more about?
So if you haven't seen compatibility switch or compatibility version for MVC before, that's the way that we make it easy for us to develop features and easy for you to upgrade to new versions of the libraries. So you can go get on ASP.NET Core 2.2 when it comes out, and you're not going to get a bunch of major changes from MVC just by referencing the new libraries. You might get some new features, you might get some new bug fixes. Other things like endpoint routing, where we know that it's not 100% compatible, you have to opt into that behavior. You have to choose that behavior. And there's a bunch of these things that some of them are bugs that we fixed. If you read through the documentation on the compatibility version, enum, or somewhere in there, I wrote a novel somewhere in there. But you can see where we've painstakingly documented all the things that are controlled by the various switches. Some of them will go away when we do 3.0, and some of them will remain. I think the old routing system is probably something that will remain for a very, very long time. But like things that are like, well, we fixed a bug in 2.1 and we expect that it maybe broke a few people. Those are compatibility switch for now. They'll go away in 3.0 and we'll have the new behavior only.
Cool. So although in 2.2 most of the new features are sort of under the covers, one of the things we are shipping is a new type for generating links. So if you are familiar with generating links today, you might have seen this IURL helper, which is accessible in a view. So in this case, we're generating a link to an action, so index on home. There are some issues with this, one being that it's tied to MVC and views. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say some of the issues with this. One, this API has been around forever, right? So like, this is something old that we had probably MVC 1.0. I wasn't on the team then, so it's probably in high school then. But the main pain points that people point out with us is this request is actually, or this service, IURL helper, is not actually even a service. So you can't like DI it. It's not a singleton, and it requires an HTTP context to create one, or an action context to create one. So basically,
it basically ticks all the boxes for making it really hard to use.
Yeah, so it works for the things that you can do today.
Right.
Which if you're writing the same code as you did before we had middleware is fine, but I'd like to think that we've advanced a little bit. So we're creating a new singleton service as part of the endpoint routing feature. So it won't work without endpoint routing, obviously, because it's tied to that. And this new feature, link generator, is a singleton service. It works outside of the context of MVC, and it can be resolved in DI and used anywhere without being part of a request.
Cool.
So in this case, just because we're going to be demoing in MVC, in ASP.NET. It's part of a request, but there are lots of overloads on link generator which don't require an HTTP context to be passed to it. So in this demo, we've got a link generating middleware. Previously, our URL helper, you couldn't use it from within a piece of middleware. And all we're doing is we're just checking the path. If path equals link, then we generate a path by route values, and we're going to this action get all on subscription management. So I'll run this up. Anything you want to add?
No, sounds about right.
So might just take a little while to get this spun up.
And the hope here, we're interested in people's feedback on this as it's developing. You'll find it in Preview 3. There are some kind of earlier iterations of it in Preview 1 and Preview 2. Preview 3 is where we think it really kind of comes into being close to what we want to ship. So we're interested in your feedback based on Preview 3 of this.
Lee on the stream asks, is that the same IURI helper that Blazor uses?
No, it is not the same. So MVC's is URL helper, Blazor's is URI helper, and they do totally different things.
Okay.
So Blazor, for instance, allows you to set like the current URL, allows you to do navigation and stuff like that.
Okay.
So no.
Hisham asks, does that mean the link generator can be accessible in class libraries, not views?
Yes.
Yes. Very nice.
So link generator was accessible before through controllers. And if you were smart or you asked us, probably if you asked us, we could tell you how you could get at it. But I want to emphasize that it only worked within the context of MVC. So you could only really get at one once control flow had entered MVC.
Right.
So like now that we're able to generate a link in a piece of middleware, for example, we could redirect to that link. So maybe, for example, you had a piece of middleware where today, if you're unauthorized, you redirect to a login screen, you would put the URL in the configuration. Now you can specify, hey, go to this controller, go to this action.
This is actually we have in the template today, I believe, is it the error handling or error path middleware? There's the diagnostics page you see as a developer, and then there's one that is intended for production.
Error page middleware.
Error page middleware. And typically the problem with that today is that it results in you having to take like a string. There's a string in your startup class, and it's like, go to this URL when any error occurs. And it's generally you want to go to a controller or a Razor page. What you're saying now is we could go and update that middleware to support using this thing, and you could actually have a proper typed way of getting to the endpoint.
Yep.
I should log that bug. You continue, and I'll log that bug.
So there's lots of action overloads and methods hanging off link generator. So before we got a path by route values, this is a helper method that Ryan added just last night. So getting a URI by action. In this case, we're passing in an HTTP context, but previously you saw this overload didn't. And as well as getting paths, we have the ability to get a URI, so a fully qualified link to your website. And I think this one already was. And in that case, because we're not specifying the address and the scheme and that sort of stuff, we're pulling it off the HTTP context. But again, there's lots of overloads on this optional values where you can specify a base path, specify a host, specify this scheme.
So there are two flavors here. There's get path, which gets you, they're all URIs if you want to get technical, but get path gets you the path portion and back, and get URI gets you a fully qualified absolute URI. And then within those two flavors, there are two flavors. There's vanilla and chocolate. There's with an HTTP context means in the context of this request, so same host, same scheme, same all that stuff. Or there's the without an HTTP context flavor, which doesn't require one, which is great if you're generating email in a background task or something. This is feedback we've heard a lot from people. So hopefully it makes you happy.
Fully qualified, you can see here.
Yeah.
Cool, that's pretty much it for link generation. So another new feature that we're adding in 2.2 is parameter transformers. So this is, do you want to talk about parameter transformers? Actually, so today when you're generating a link, you have the ability to say like to lowercase. People have asked for, hey, wouldn't it be great if I could customize it further? I make it lowercase, but I separate each word with a dash or an underscore.
So we've definitely gotten lots of feedback about like I want all my action names to appear lowercase. I want my want this parameter to be kebab case or slugified or those kind of things. And we're adding a feature for that as part of endpoint routing.
Yeah, so now in a URL, previously you would have seen you can add constraints. So you could say this ID has to be init. We've extended this so that you can specify more than constraints in your URL parameters. You can specify a parameter transformer, for example. So in this case, I'm going to update the default URL to slugify the controller and slugify the action. And then when I run this and I look at the generated link,
Everybody get used to looking at that startup screen.
so now our previously one-word subscription management is slugified, which is pretty great. So this is obviously there's no point generating this link if it doesn't match. So we can type it in and we can go to our endpoint, our action, and return HTML.
So how this works under the covers, by the way, is we sort of like rewrite what URL the routing system is going to expect for this. So you don't change your code. You still write your controller name and your action name as you did before. You just change one spot in the route. Or I believe we have a thing on options that's sort of like do this to all my routes, right?
Yeah.
We have a thing that's specific to MVC that says, I'll give you a parameter transformer. You be a good boy and apply it to all my MVC
Attributes.
Pages, attribute routes, controller action. So for the area controller action page, those route parameters.
Yeah. So you shouldn't need to go through every single action and every single controller adding this slugify thing. You can do it in one place in Startup. So you can see it's specified up here. So the way we're plugging it in is actually via the old constraint system, which we could maybe do something here, but for now we've got constraint map, and then this is just an implementation of the I outbound parameter transformer. So it's just doing a bit of regex on the incoming parameter and slugifying it. So we can take this to a crazy extreme. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Zalgo text.
I'm very familiar with Zalgo text.
So if you've ever seen, there's a quite famous Stack Overflow answer talking about parsing HTML with regex that gets progressively more and more insane. So this is Zalgo text, Zalgo case.
If you've been inspired by the answer to this question and you want your whole lifestyle to be this way, then James has got the feature for you.
So
there's a whole rabbit hole of Zalgo.
Yeah.
So imagine if we could automatically Zalgo our application URLs. So there's no way I could type that in, but if we come here, we generate this crazy thing. So this crazy thing is encoded because we, as good citizens of the world, we encode our URLs, but when I type it in,
see that Chrome is happy to display the decoded URL. So don't do this if you care about your users.
Never do this.
Or if you care about humanity at all. Don't do this, but you can.
You can. Such is the power of...
You can definitely trick out your MySpace with that.
Yeah.
It's real edgy. I like it.
I love how it's up in the taskbar too, or the bar, the title.
Yeah. And I think that's it for parameter transformers.
Okay.
So do you want to
switch over? We're going to switch over here?
Yep.
Cool. So apologies for the static or whatever happens when we switch.
No, it's all right. I switched back to the camera.
Switch the old
We're professional
HDMI.
here. I could have just switched back to John. Then everyone's looking at John.
Professional presentation thing guy here. All right, let me know when I'm on.
John's looking cool.
Yeah.
Or something.
I wanted to start the thing like this and be like, oh, hello.
Okay, we now see your screen.
That
Right.
could become your new signature. So I'm gonna embiggen this a little bit here. So let's talk about. Tell Damien if this isn't right, if this is too small. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the endpoint in endpoint routing because we haven't really explained what that is.
All right.
If you're curious about where you can find this, if you think this is cool and you want to experiment with it, you can on 2.2, Preview 2, or later. I'm on Preview 2, I think.
Okay.
So if you're curious about where you can find this, you can actually find this here at this link, and this is the index.cush.html. So
Are you going to make that? Is that a thing now?
it is going to be a thing.
Okay.
It's going to be a thing. So I've got a really simple little MVC app. You can see I've got my compatibility mode 2.2 here. I've got a really simple app with an index and an error action on home controller, and that is all I've got here. And I've got the basic use MVC, traditional, conventional default route that you're used to seeing here. So I'm going to embiggen this as well. Sorry about that. So what I've got here is I've got a little demo page that is going to list all the endpoints. And you can think of an endpoint abstractly as a thing that can be routed at or can be link generated at. Sometimes it's both, sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's neither, maybe. But you can think of an endpoint as like a unit of routing, an atom of routing, a molecule of routing. So I've got slash, I've got home index with an ID parameter, I've got home error with an optional ID parameter. And if you're familiar with or you played with MVC routing before, you know that like all of these things will work, right? If I put in home here, it takes me to the same place. If I put in home index here, you put in home index here, it's going to take me to this action again. If I put in home error here, I'll see the error page, right? So everything kind of, it does a routing. That's what you'd expect. The way that this works is when you write this, we call this a conventional route because it has controller and action in the names. We denormalize these now. And that's the way that we sort of build this efficient like routing table of endpoints. So we denormalize this route by performing substitution. So we would substitute for all the controllers and for the actions the relevant values into this template. And that's what gets us this list of stuff. And the reason why we're doing this is that this is really what we're after here. And so we've ended up with, this is a depiction of what the implementation is like. We have this very efficient little tree here, or try, if you're hip to that, where all of these edges are URL path segments. And so we traverse we tokenize the URL path on slashes, and then we traverse it based on the text. And in each of these little nodes, we just have to do a very simple matching operation. And you could imagine that if at any point there is no transition out of the state you're in, then that's a 404. We've given up at that point. So like to trace this path, I could say home index 17 because my route is controller action ID. And that'll work, right? It's going to re-render this page. And so that path would look like, well, home, and then index, and then this is a star, so this would accept anything, and then I end up here, right? So this is just a little depiction of how it works. So to sort of get a little deeper here, I've got this person controller, and it's not showing up because I haven't defined any actions here yet. So let me just uncomment some of these. And I've got HTTP get, HTTP put, so on in here, typical API stuff. And I'm going to relaunch this, and we're going to look at how this graph and this list have changed.
So Avinash asks, how is this different from current routing?
So it's not very different from the tree router.
Okay.
If you've been using the old conventional routing system, you can think of the routes that you put in startup code here is one system. And the routes that you put in attributes is another system.
Right.
Razor Pages uses the attribute routing system. We say attribute routing versus conventional routing, and they're both a difference in how you configure it and a difference in how it's implemented.
Today.
Right? Today. And the rule is for how it works today in 2.1 and earlier is that attribute routes always run first and then conventional routes always run second. So we're basically doing our best to simulate that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why we do this is it's just much more scalable for us to look at, like, if you have a lot of routes or if you have like a lot of attribute routes, it's much more scalable for us to build a tree and interpret it than it is to process like a list of things.
Care to hazard defining a lot?
A lot. So I know that with Orchard in ASPNET 4X, they had a lot of problems with like 20 to 30 routes.
Oh wow, that's not many at
Yeah,
all. Okay.
yeah. I mean, we quickly, so based on prototyping and things like that and the benchmarks we did early, we very quickly overtook conventional routing at the level of maybe 10 routes or so.
Okay.
And so it's easy to get there, right? At the same time, it's kind of beneficial to have one system just from the point of view of everything having the same quirks and everything having the same underlying implementation.
Is it fair to say that there's a different unit of scale? Like it scales differently in the new system versus the old difference?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the old system scaled somewhat linearly with the number of routes that you have.
Okay.
This new system is a tree, right? So it's O of log n for some n.
So
and is
log
is it like path segments?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So so the algorithm here is actually O of n with respect to the number of path segments in the URL.
So you could have 1,000 routes, but if ultimately you only ever have 3 or 4 segments, you're only really the algorithm of this is basically scaling to the fact that you have n is the 4
and there's
segments.
some cost associated with processing the segments
obviously.
as well.
Yeah.
Processing individual segments, but that's fairly optimized too. So the main worry is that if you're feeding us a lot of the wrong type of data, it could be expensive.
I see.
So unpacking this a little bit, I've updated this and I've added that person controller. So you can see we've got another top level branch coming off here. And then there's a person with an ID parameter, which is, I believe, these actions. So get an update, take an ID, get all doesn't take an ID. So you can see that these are the ones for get all, and these are the ones for get with an ID. But then it gets really interesting because we have these edges here that are prefixed with HTTP. And the reason why I've written it this way, this is code that I wrote to generate the graph. HTTP means the HTTP method. So in this case, we're not just branching on URL path. We're saying that if you get to this node and you're at the end of the path, then the next decision is to branch on the HTTP method. So we take the HTTP method and we say, is it a get or is it a something else? So if it's a get, we're going to go to that action, which is this get all action here. And then if it's not something, not that, we're going to do something we haven't been able to do for a while that people who are used to old Web API are missing, sadly, is we're going to return an HTTP 405 because this system has that capability built in. So that's a thing for if you're somebody who's been frustrated with that in the past, endpoint routing has that. I want to add another level of complexity here by using these things.
So previous endpoint routing didn't do anything with the verb, the HTTP verb. It only looked at...
Previous routing didn't do anything with the HTTP verb.
Yep.
Those features were all inside MVC.
Yeah, so there was, and in many ways, routing was very decoupled from MVC, but at the same time, logic which you need if you're writing a web API was embedded in MVC. So it was both decoupled in the fact that performance wasn't as good as it could be, and tied together in that it was difficult to use routing by itself.
Yeah. So now I've uncommented these consumes methods here, and they're both named create JSON, which I think was just influenced by James. But one of them is meant to handle XML, and one of them is meant to handle JSON. This is a somewhat common thing. If you have multiple content types you have to handle, sometimes they can be the same model, sometimes they can't, right? I'm going to correct this. So it's
Christian gave you a little party.
Oh yeah.
In the chat, I'm assuming it was in relation. Christian Helling, yeah.
Oh,
I think it was. I'm assuming it was in relation to your 405.
Yeah,
web
I'm
API
sure that sounds like him.
people,
That sounds like him.
Yeah.
So consumes is a feature of routing in MVC that will branch based on the content type. So we can branch based on the HTTP method. We can select based on the HTTP method. We can also branch based on the content type. So that also gets built into this graph.
Can I make my own ones of those? Like
You can make
things?
your own
Can I
ones
make
of
one
those.
like based on the time of day?
You could make a time of day one. You could
That's
make an A/B
fantastic.
testing one. You could make a versioning one.
A/B testing one is cool.
Yeah, that is cool.
With like weighting and ratios and things.
So
Someone
we're
in the community should build that, and then
interested-
then John will put it in the community section.
That's right.
we're interested to see what people will build with this. So we can bake into the graph this very efficient little branching thing of tokenizing the URL, walking all the segments, so O of n with respect to the number of segments, and then O of n with respect to the number of policies. So policies are things like HTTP methods or consumes. You'll notice that my original cute little graph of this application is unchanged. So these things are very localized. Like there's a consumes policy here, and it's completely pay for play. It only shows up when you're routing to here. It doesn't influence the graph generation of any of this other stuff. So that's some of the stuff we're doing, and we're basically trying to make the extensibility for this be scalable, make the performance of it be scalable, and make as much of MVC's action selection and routing stuff be baked into a lower layer of the system where it's more introspectable and more reusable.
Yeah, previously this was done at runtime by MVC, and performance was nowhere near as good.
So speaking about that, I have prepared some slides. And there's a couple things that we're doing to test this. One of the things that we're doing to test this is we've actually, I'm not going to go to the slides yet. One of the things that we've been doing to test this is we have taken the route table of Azure and the route table of GitHub, at least their public API surface. So I wrote a handy little tool here, somewhere in here. It's called the Swagatherer. So I wrote this little tool here that takes Swagger files. So if you're familiar with Swagger or OpenAPI, the like API spec, takes a bunch of Swagger files and then creates for us a benchmark that we can run for testing. So for performance testing of routing. So for instance, like this one this is Azure's route table. And you can see there's 5,160 endpoints. And they're all listed here. So this is all public information. I'm not leaking anything secret. Don't send the Microsoft.
God, I muted you like 20 seconds ago.
Don't send the Microsoft secret police to my house. But these are Azure's like management APIs, right? They're publicly documented management APIs dumped into the form of a benchmark that we use for routing. So all of our like benchmarking and performance testing for this has largely been based on real world stuff. So we use Azure and we use GitHub. GitHub's public API is significantly smaller because it's all Azure, all services.
So the graph that you saw before would be absolutely enormous.
Yeah, so you can, I've done the GitHub one. I've taken the graph output of the GitHub one and pasted it into a web graph viz for. I think it took a couple minutes to load. I haven't tried with the Azure one. I'm not super keen on it. That's one thing that we're doing for testing is we're doing testing with these very large, kind of large, medium, small sets of APIs that are based on real world definitions. Another thing that we're doing for testing is I have some results from Tekken Power. So if you're familiar with Tekken Power is a set of benchmarks for web frameworks, and they're kind of serve as these minimal benchmarks that pretty much anybody can implement. And you're looking at the graph of MVC's implementation of Tekken Power plain text over a couple months. So you can see we're starting off here around 450 kilo RPS. Here is where we introduced endpoint routing. Here is probably where we fixed bugs because it got slower.
It got slower.
And then here is the jump up again of when we sort of fully committed MVC's action selection stuff to be handled by endpoint routing. So the net change here is about 100,000 KRPS.
And so that's nearly, it's like 20 to 25%?
Yeah.
Wow,
from
that's
just
significant.
Routing. And this is on, your mileage may vary. This
course.
is on a minimal, we're talking about the overhead, right?
Right.
We're talking about the minimal overhead of the framework. So we've lowered that about 20 to 25%.
But would you describe this as best case? I mean, a worst case improvement? Like, people in the real world with real applications, multiple routes, will probably see a bigger improvement.
If you have a really significant route table, you might see a bigger improvement in this. If you have a small route table, you see a fairly modest.
The app in this case like literally only has a few endpoints, right?
Yeah, the app has like one controller.
JSON and plain text is like two segments. Yeah.
And it's like basically returns the text, right? Like it's
not a complex routing decision.
But in this case, the modest improvement is a 20% improvement.
Right. So to Ryan's point, the overhead of even running routing for the most simple case, we reduced by quite a lot.
Yeah, by quite a lot.
Yeah.
And most of the savings here weren't actually, URL processing had something to do with it. The URL processing of the old system and the new system for a single segment was kind of a wash. But we have a new system that has a lot more features and a lot more scalability, and the perf is better for simple cases.
Do we have any idea if there are perf improvements on the link generation side?
There are not.
Okay.
It's roughly the same.
Okay.
we're doing some features that will help with that, but I'm not really ready to talk about them today.
Okay.
We have some ideas. Mostly the idea that I'd share is the idea that you could create a template and you could sort of fold parameters into it and then reuse that template over and over again. So if you want to generate a table with 100 links to 100 different items,
you just pay the, I see.
Then, but we're not really ready to talk about data for that or anything. That's not fully fleshed out.
Okay.
Is there any kind of overlap? So I know you've showed some stuff like the hypermedia and the different things, just URL like RESTful routing, like all kinds of different options that are kind of on the API side. I'm curious if there's any kind of overlap with some of the other things that are going on with the 2.2 wave, with like Swagger generation and all that kind of like API related stuff.
So for Swagger generation, what we had to do there was just not break it, because we already, the way that that's layered is we produce a layer on top of MVC's understanding that basically says like, here are my actions. We call it API Explorer, and the two Swagger providers that I'm aware of are written on top of that. And then we've required you to use attribute routing with Swagger for a while because it is more predictable and it's more, we can say with more certainty what URLs your actions are going to match if you're doing attribute routing than with conventional routing. We sort of have the technology to build a conventional routing experience for it, but we haven't really seen demand that justifies putting the work into it. Is that kind of what you're asking, or?
Yeah. I was just wondering, like, for instance, if there are other Swagger features that we haven't really been able to support in the past, or things like that. If there's more.
I don't think so. From this, most of what we're interested in with this is kind of on the runtime side and on the integration with endpoints. If I think of anything, I'll come back to it. The other thing is a little bonus that I'm going to spend 10 seconds talking about and move on. I noticed this today when I was combing through this data. This is where we turn tiered JIT on. And this is the startup time of that self-same app.
Oh, wow.
So the total, the number you should be really interested in here is the top bar. You can see, like right here, we traded some time in startup code for some time on the first request, which is kind of a wash, right? The number you should be interested in is the top one. So tiered JIT for a really, really bare bones MVC app took up about 200 milliseconds of startup time. For another one of the ones I looked at, I think it was the one with EF, the Fortunes Tekken power test with MVC, took off 500 milliseconds.
Wow.
So this went from 800 ms to about 600. That one went from 2 seconds to 1.5.
So that's impressive. And my guess is that, well, first of all, tiered JIT, to remind folks, is available as an option in 2.1x and was turned on by default in 2.2 Preview 2.
Yeah.
And we very much hope to leave it on in 2.2 RTM by default, but that very much relies on us getting feedback from folks. In fact, I was in Shipper this morning, and there was a bug that came in because a partner had started seeing a particular issue when tiered JIT was enabled. So we need that type of feedback to have confidence that we can release 2.2 with this on by default. But it's fantastic to see these types of improvements. Yeah. Is this the assumption here because it's using lots of generics, or there's been some things in the past that JIT and cross-gen, which is the thing that we use before, like the framework gets pre-JITted before you even run your app, isn't particularly good at doing other things, and so like you have to pay the full JIT cost to get things like generics and p-invokes and things to work well. Do we have an idea what it is here, or is it just maybe the lower quality first run is just faster and it's just all it is here?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's also, you have to reckon with things that aren't cross-gen, like your app isn't cross-gen. Right. I haven't done the profiling to figure it out. I looked at this data and I said, James, was this you? And he said, yeah, that was me. I did that. Actually, I told him, I said, hey, James, I think this was you. And I said, hey, Seb, what do you think about this? And he said, oh, no, that's tiered JIT. James had nothing to do with it.
Seb, I know you're watching. It'd be great if you could automatically. So Seb builds all these charts for us.
Yeah.
And
he draws them.
And maintains. Yeah, he has a drafting board and a nice box of crayons. It'd be lovely, Seb, if when a significant change occurs, you could find the commit, which I know you have because you can hover over these points and it gives you the commit, and then put the avatar as a data point of the GitHub commit, so that we could just look at it and go, oh, that one was James, and that one was
I know
Spicy
he wants
Boy,
to
and
do
that
that
one
for regressions.
What's that?
I know he would want to do that for regressions.
We'll just make it bigger for regressions, so that we can really, really see
Wall of shame.
Yeah, the wall of shame built in.
Yeah. Okay.
Christian has a story. Christian has a question before we move on.
Let's hear his story.
So Christian asks, I'll go back to the camera for this.
Yeah.
Is there a story for endpoint data source in 2.2 that we can hook into? There's tons of middleware that handle paths today that would benefit, and everyone could reason about the routes.
Yeah. So not in 2.2, not
Okay.
in a supported way.
Okay.
I'm sure. I know Christian, and I'm sure he'll find a way to come up with something
Yes.
compelling. Let me answer this in a somewhat Machiavellian way. We're not telling you that you'll be happy and successful doing that in 2.2.
Okay.
Our focus, James has actually been working on 3.0 for kind of a while now.
And we're going to see it.
Yeah, and
soon.
he's going to start talking about that now.
Ooh.
The set of things that are exposed through public APIs in 2.2 is deliberately limited to avoid creating a Pandora's box
Okay.
that is a half thought through scenario.
Yeah.
Your experience is use MVC that you use today,
Okay.
Yeah.
and attribute routes.
So congratulations to those who have stuck on the live stream this long. We're 55 minutes in
my.
now. And we're going to show you some super future stuff. We haven't talked much about 3.0 on this show simply because 3.0, the public messaging about 3.0 to date has all been about WinForms and WPF, obviously. And then there's a bunch of the features that come along with that. And we're still busy working on 2.2. And so we don't want to jump ahead and start talking about all the great ASPNET Core 3.0 features when we don't even know what they are yet because we're still building the 2.2 features. But a couple of the members of the team, James is one of them, has finished their 2.2 work and is now looking at 3.0 stuff. So this is probably our first glimpse at 3.0 real stuff, on this show. So, all right, James, let's blow us away.
Blow us away.
Okay.
All right, so endpoint routing is more than just performance improvements. So that's what you'll see in 2.2. You also see the link generator. But there are a number of bigger goals around endpoint routing. So the first one we'll talk about is when you call use MVC, that happens at the very end of your middleware pipeline. And your route is matched and it's executed. So your route is matched to an action and that action is executed straight away, right at the very end. So if I bring up a PowerPoint.
Ooh. And this is what Christian's question was about this kind of stuff.
Right.
So
So-
he already knows where this is going. Spoilers.
So imagine you had two pieces of middleware. You had your custom middleware and you had routing middleware, which is basically what happens with use MVC. So a request comes in, /admin, your custom middleware executes it, it then flows along through to your routing middleware, and the current routing middleware router matches it to an action, in this case, admin controller index. It then executes the action, and then the request flows out. So the problem with this today is the custom middleware has no knowledge of what the final action is. So you know the URL, you know it's /admin. You don't know exactly which action it's going to. Like someone could change a route within MVC and suddenly /admin is going, instead of to index, it could be going to, I don't know, home or view all or something else. Like they could just change the default action at that point. So that's a big problem today with middleware, and it's why a lot of pieces of middleware, pieces of functionality that could be middleware, exist within MVC. Ryan, can you give us some examples? Like
Cores,
authorization,
caching,
even Coneg to an extent.
content negotiation.
Yes.
Anything where there's a filter version and a middleware version is like an oops.
Yep. And
Yeah.
in the old world with Signaler prior to Core, Signaler Hubs had its own filter pipeline. And it was the exact same thing. Like you could plug stuff into the filter pipeline, but it was also middleware itself. And so you'd have to make a decision, like, does it go in the pipeline? Does it go in middleware? Do they work together? What order are they in? This is all the same kettle of fish. So.
Like you as a user in your custom middleware, like you might want someone to put an attribute on the controller action.
Right.
And you want to see that action. You
want to
see that
react
attribute.
somehow.
Yeah, like you want to go, there's that attribute there. I want to do some caching, or I want to modify a header, add a header.
It's actually interesting because we've had during Katana prior to Project K and DNX and ASPNET Core, we had a lot of discussions about these types of features and where does the metadata about an endpoint belong. Some folks advocate for I want to put all my things in a single place. And they want one file in their application where all the metadata for a subsystem like cores or whatever is in. And then other folks are like, no, like it really makes sense that I want to put the metadata as close to the executing resource as possible, but then maybe the thing that actually that operates on that metadata could be anywhere. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't have to be in the subsystem. And so whether it's cores or authorization or routing information or coneg, whatever it might be, we've gone back and forth. I think it's fair to say that as a team, the idiom that we've kind of gravitated towards the framework is the latter, which is we kind of want all this metadata to be as close to the endpoint as possible. So if you're in a signal or hub, which is a class, you put attributes on that hub or even on the method. If you want some things to just be for certain methods. And same for controllers and MVC, you put them on the controller class, or you put them in the action method. If you have a razor page, you can put them on the page model, or eventually perhaps you can put them in your view start or something like that. It doesn't mean you don't have a conventional way of doing it or an imperative way of doing it, I mean, but it's nice, generally speaking, I think most people have said they like to have it close to the resource where it applies.
And then user experience.
It's a better user experience, I think. It's generally easier. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean you can't have a more global place for when things are repetitive. That makes total sense.
Or I would add to that works great if it's your stuff.
Yes.
If it's not your stuff.
If you're bringing in someone else's stuff and you want to change it,
totally out of luck.
then you need to have a facility to plug in convention and metadata on top of stuff that you've brought in. And I think you're going to explain that we support all of this in Endpoint Routing.
We support all of it.
Okay.
So, the big problem here is the fact that we match at the end. What happens if we match at the start? So now we have endpoint routing middleware. Our request comes in. We match it. So the graph that Ryan showed earlier matches to a controller action. Then our custom middleware runs. Our custom middleware is able to look at the context of requests and see, hey, an endpoint has already been matched. The match is to an action.
And that could be something like, hey, what's the cores policy? Is there a cores attribute on this action?
Yeah. And then we get to the end, and at that point, we execute the action.
Mm. So would it be fair to say that the first middleware makes a routing decision and then saves it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one important thing to talk about when we're talking about an endpoint is more than just a URL, and it's more than just an action. So it needs to execute the thing that's been matched to. It's also a bag of metadata. So in this case, if we're putting an attribute on our action, that attribute becomes a piece of metadata. So in our custom middleware, we can get our endpoint and then we can look at the various bits of metadata and we can sort of reason and change how the application works. So our custom middleware could be cores middleware. So we could take a look to see has the request actually got access to this or not. Mm-hmm. Cool. So that's it for slides. So if we take a look at the code, we can see there's no longer a use MVC. At the bottom we have use endpoint, and at the top we have this use endpoint routing. So one thing which might be a bit different to what you're used to is now instead of calling map route down at use MVC at the bottom, we're calling map MVC route at the top. And just that's a conceptual thing, the fact that we're now doing our matching at the beginning of our middleware pipeline rather than at our end.
Mm-hmm. And it is just middleware, right? Like you could put anything you want in front of that, after that, so on, right?
Yeah. So we can see here we've got our authorization middleware, and if we take a look at the source code for our authorization middleware,
this is new.
This is new.
This doesn't exist today.
Yeah. This is all on.
Is this the production version or is it the James version?
Who
says they're different?
Yeah.
This is a temporary branch.
Okay.
So if we take a look at our middleware, we can see we've got our HTTP context, and we're getting from this a feature called endpoint feature. And on an endpoint feature, delivers an endpoint. So we're doing this because if we weren't matched to anything, potentially this could be null. Also, this could be null if there's no match. And then from our endpoint, we're looking at the metadata, and we're getting our authorization metadata attribute. and we're saying, hey, let's only run this authorization middleware if someone added some metadata to it to say it should run. It requires some kind of role. And then if a role is required, we come down and we check the super secret query string authentication method. And if the value of role matches one of our valid roles within the metadata, so we've got some roles hanging off our metadata, then we allow the pipeline to continue. Otherwise, we say you are unauthorized, and we tell them what endpoint they were not authorized to. So how would we get metadata on it? So it would just be as simple as adding, oops, the code's already running. It would be as simple as putting an attribute on this. So when MVC starts up, it provides a collection of endpoints to the routing system. And as part of that, it obviously figures out all the correct URLs for them. But it also collects various bits of metadata about all those endpoints. And one of the things it does is it gets all the attributes that is on the action combined with the attributes that are on the controller, and it throws them in this metadata collection, which we see up here.
Now, so the fact that that's authorization metadata and not say the authorized attribute is kind of because it's a demo sort of.
It's a demo, yes.
So we would retrofit pretty much the things that you have access to today. We'd be looking to retrofit in a way that they still work in the way that you're familiar with.
Right.
But it's a system that's a little bit more inclusive, and lots of features get to play together in the system rather than it being a filter that just MVC understands.
These siloed sort of things that they are today. Yep.
So if we come along and we run this website, when we start up, I'll put a breakpoint in. So our app starts up. We hit our middleware, so we can see we have a endpoint. So in this case, we're mapping to this index action on the home controller, and we have a route pattern. In this case, a route pattern is an empty string because this is the default page for the website. And we can see we've got this metadata collection. And within that metadata collection, we can then pull out the authorization metadata that's been populated into the metadata by MVC, and then we're able to interrogate it, and we see because there was no query string with the value of roles, we fall down and we were unauthorized.
Shiny.
But if we then say role equals admin, we're able to continue and we get to our web page.
So this is showing me a few things. I'm trying to think of this app developer perspective. This will let me write different code, and it'll also give me insight into logging and analysis. I can see why routes are behaving the way they are at runtime.
You're able to see what the endpoint is from within metadata, so that will be new.
Well, it's actually interesting, application insights today, when you add it to ASPNET Core, either programmatically or via the light up features in Azure, it wants to log what request is processing, right? But you have to think of the order of execution of what's going on today in an ASP.NET Core application. The MVC action isn't known until well after the request has started and after pretty much all the other middleware has already gone through the incoming phase. And so what they have to do is they have to inject not only listeners that understand when the request actually started from the Kestrel point of view, the service point of view, but they then have to hook into MVC using a different diagnostic source listener to understand, well, what action am I going to be running against, so they can get the action name. So that rather than just saying, oh, I hit this URL, they can tell you what controller action actually fired when they eventually log the request trace. So they have to hook multiple places to get the most basic kind of experience they want for logging. You could imagine in a future version, they wouldn't have to do quite so many things.
And there are things that are missing from that.
Right.
So health checks.
Right.
Or the auth endpoints or static files.
Right.
Right. they don't know that that went to an auth endpoint
Nope.
or to static files
Nope.
or.
They have no idea.
Like
It's just-
they could do something like they have an attribute and you only log stuff which happens for that request for action by action.
Right.
Like they could interrogate, hey, I've got an action, does it have the right attribute to do logging? Okay, now I'm going to log just for this one single action.
Right. Yeah. There's a whole. It opens up a whole bunch of flexibilities for people to add conditions and caveats and whatever other things they want to do to whether they take action or not as a middleware.
Yeah.
Right, as
Now
an
you've
example.
got the health checks
Yeah.
thing here. Is that the actual health checks middleware? Or is that
No.
a fake one? It's
This
a fake
is
one.
a fake one. I
We're-
was just going to say, so that's one of the goals of endpoint routing. So it's to be able to break routing out from something which just happens within MVC to something which happens throughout the entire request pipeline, and then you can hook into it. So another thing is being able to easily add and define your own endpoint. So for example, health checks. Do you want to?
Yeah. So with the health checks thing, like how would you configure security for that? Since like let's say it's some package, it's some NuGet package that you got off the internet, and like you didn't write that.
So
right? So how are you going to put the authorized attribute on that?
You don't want me to be able to.
Yeah. So in particular, I don't want James to access this. Right? Only admins. Damien's the only admin.
So this is.
Yeah. Okay. That's a good health check.
Yeah.
It fails
So
randomly.
So what we can do is previously we added metadata via this attribute within MVC. You can also add metadata during your startup experience. So for example, we could say require authorization. And again, we could say admin.
And this is something James has done for the demo, but imagine that we had this duality. Where
Right.
There's a set of attributes that configure things. There's a set of conventions and builders that configure things.
Right.
And the key is here, like, you're configuring the behavior of something you didn't write,
Right.
right? And you're configuring it using the same primitives that you're using when you do MVC.
And the reason that works is because everyone now agrees that they plug into the one global endpoint/routing system where all this stuff comes together.
Yeah. And so, like, this health check middleware that you wrote has no knowledge of authorization, doesn't even care that authorization is a thing, right?
So Christian is looking at your code and obviously envisaging the future.
File your bugs in the JSON.NET repo.
And he's asking, and he thinks he has his answer now. It's like, so we could ship extension methods to the InPoint convention builder.
Yes.
if you wanted
Exactly.
to. Yes,
Yes.
you absolutely
Exactly.
could.
So that's exactly what this is. If we come in and look at the source code, we're passing in a T, which in this case is a InPoint convention route builder. We're saying for this metadata, add that attribute. A piece of metadata doesn't need to be an attribute. This is just a demo.
Right.
This was just the easiest way to do it. But this is just saying, hey, for this particular endpoint, in this case it was our health checks endpoint, let's just sprinkle a little bit of security on it.
Yeah, and then Christian makes the point that this will be awesome for identity server, Swashbuckle, etc. Basically, any of the other systems on the planet that want to know about all the stuff in your app. And the thought I was having before was like, now you can imagine. Today we have the various Swagger or Open API system, with NSwag or Swashbuckle. And I think Ryan, you said they plug into our what is it, the metadata? We have
API Explorer.
API Explorer. Imagine that, but now they're plugging into the endpoint router version of that.
Yep.
And so now they can you could have Nancy and MVC running in the same app and both feeding into your Swagger docs. All via endpoint routing, rather than have to add the Nancy integration plus the
North Star here is like, I want to use some other component inside my app. Let's say a streaming logs provider, or something, an endpoint that can deliver me streaming logs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have to care what technology they use to implement that.
right
But I want a uniform way to say configure security.
or cause or
cause.
whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's funny actually thinking back in system web days. We had like the location element in your web.config file. And because everything was basically handled by modules and handlers, you would just say, oh, assuming the thing that you were trying to protect or configure was a handler, you could just have a location thing, say the path, and then everything under there applied to that thing.
Mm-hmm.
That was all configuration first, it was all IIS-centric. We're kind of coming full circle and now saying, well, we're in a code-first world now. But we'd had this super flexible pipeline called middleware where you just like stack stuff together, but nothing knows about anything else accept the next thing that's running, and even then it doesn't know what it is. It's just a function. We're kind of going one step ahead now. We now have this ability to at least say, hey, run here, here's a bunch of metadata that anyone else can get to, which they can use to make decisions about other things, and then on the way back you can do the same thing. So, cool.
So the final thing we're sort of aiming to achieve is breaking out routing from being tied to MVC. So previously, a lot of logic, you would need to have a proper routing experience for a web framework like cores, like
HTTP method
HTTP
selection
method consumes, like all of that was embedded within MVC.
Right.
So it should be possible for anyone writing a web application framework in the future to take endpoint routing and quite easily plug it in. Like all it is you just start, your framework just starts defining routes, and then use endpoint routing will match up those routes, and then it will, when it executes down here on use endpoint, it will call into your web framework. So I don't know if David wants me to show this, but
he's not here.
Do it because he's not here.
That's right.
because he's not here. So this is a little web framework that David Fowler wrote.
Could we call it a micro framework?
A micro framework. So there's no MVC involved. And just as a thought exercise, earlier in the week, we replatted this on top of endpoint routing. And it was a very simple change. It was like maybe 100 or 200 lines of code. So now what we have happening here is we've still got use endpoint routing. We have it as a different method rather than as a lambda. That's just syntax. Again, we have use endpoint, but our endpoint routing in this case, rather than our map MVC route, we have these sort of custom methods that this framework provides. So it's a custom way of saying, hey, for this products API, get all method, go to this location. And again, these are just routes in the end.
It's the same route template syntax. It's the same things you're probably familiar with already.
Like if you want, you could start putting in Slugify in here, and you could do that. And all this is doing is it's really just generating a list of endpoints that our engine is executing, and then will match into calling our get all method.
Right.
It's got a lock. This has problems. Follow your bugs on David Fowler's Twitter account, please.
That's funny. Hisham has a question. Can we use the link generation to generate URLs on the fly for APIs, docs, or temp URLs for resources, etc.? Can we use the link generation to generate the URLs on the fly for API docs? Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. So
If your app's running.
Assuming your app is running, but for example, the various subsystems that produce Swagger docs live in the browser or as an endpoint would use this to generate the links that they use.
They could now, because it's not going to take an HTTP context.
Right. And he makes just a further follow-up comment is route configuration in one place reminds him of the Razor Pages routing. So Razor Pages is actually an interesting example. It's in that Ryan said before, it's built on the attribute routing system. But most of it is actually convention in the fact that the name of your file is what denotes the route, as in the path. But then we give you a way to override that, but it is imperative. It's not, you can't put an attribute on anything. You have to go into your startup and say add stuff. So you do get this, what we talked about before. You can put it on the resource, well in this case it's the file name, and then we added the ability in 2.1 to say app page and then override the route completely. Or you can do it with code, because you might want to do it more centrally. So
we might try to clean some of that stuff up.
Yeah, in 3.0
in 3.0.
Yes, I agree.
I wouldn't expect any changes there for 2.2, but everything in 2.2 should be functionally the same as it is.
So we are at an hour and 18 minutes in, so I think it's probably a good time to say
goodbye.
To pull the cord. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope folks got a lot out of this. I think this is our first in-depth look at this feature. Just to recap, endpoint routing is in 2.2, but is exclusively for use by MVC. MVC will use this by default if you set the compat mode to 2.2. Which obviously new projects will. When you upgrade to 2.2, you'll have to flip that manually if you want to use the endpoint routing to get the advantages. Other than the perf improvements, you also get the link generator, which means that anything in your application, even if it's not running in the context of MVC and a request, can get links to stuff in MVC.
Parameter transformers as well.
Oh, and we got that nice little URL transformer thing, so you can do slugification and whatever other crazy things that you want to do. turn it into Klingon or something, I don't know. And so then in 3.0, we saw a preview of what this might turn into in terms of really pushing it out of MVC and make it all available to everybody.
Yep.
So thanks a lot for coming. John, thanks for sitting in your office and not saying much for the last hour. That's great. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I was just watching in shock and amazement. Wonderful.
We did
And
it.
I thanks for everyone for bearing with us while we got through all the technical stuff again. But we got it working all by ourselves, so I feel like we've graduated this studio now. We can get it all up and running by ourselves. Are we on next week, John? Do we have something set up for next week?
We don't have anything set up. I'm happy to do something.
Let's get something sorted out in the next couple of days, and we can.
Could we maybe do Blazor by then?
That it could do. Is 06.0 going to be out by next Tuesday?
Hope so.
If not, could we just show it anyway?
Yeah, we can show it. We can hype it up.
Let's we'll try and get that going. See if we can get Dan, Steve, and Ryan and the rest of the Blazor crew on next week. And
I'll heckle in the comments.
What's that?
I'll heckle in the comments.
Yeah, fair. Sounds great. You'll be back in New Zealand by then.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thanks everybody. I'm going to sign us. We don't have dramatic zoom out anymore, so we still haven't set that up in the new studio.
We can roll our chairs away.
We could roll our chairs away.
You have to go on the OBS box. And
I know, but then I'm doing this. I'm like, oh wait, I'm gonna. Nah, this does not even
so
work. All right.
complicated.
See you everybody.